Hello there, everyone. If you have seen my Instagram recently, you may have seen that my husband gifted me the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. I've reorganized mine by color for the sake of this video to kind of walk you through the palette. I've had it for about a week at this point, and I've been kind of gathering thoughts, using it every day. And at this point, I feel ready to at least tell you how I'm initially feeling about the palette and show you all of my best comparisons and alternatives if you are not buying from Natasha Denona or can't afford the price tag attached to this palette. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and just keep on watching and subscribe. Before we get too far into this, I just want to take a quick second and say thank you so much for helping me reach 1,000 subscribers. I am now officially monetized and it's very exciting. If you're curious, I have made $1.87 thus far. So maybe we'll do a video about that sometime in the future. Know that there is a giveaway coming and it's going to be a lot better than my 500 subscriber giveaway. If you are interested in that, I'm going to be doing a live stream soon and that's where I'll talk more about it. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Now let's get into what lies in front of us. So I'm not necessarily the biggest Natasha Denona girly out here, but I am very glad my husband decided to gift this to me. But I did have one Midi palette before this. I had the Glam, although I've deconstructed it and it now lives with my single shadows. So I've laid out the Glam palette in kind of color order here. So I thought that might be helpful to compare it to the actual color story of the new I Need a Nude palette. And I think you can see they're not very similar. They both have this kind of like lighter shade, but in I Need a Nude, it's a lot more peachy, whereas in the Glam palette, it's almost like more gray. There also is just generally a little bit more depth that you're able to get out of the Glam palette. Like I would say this kind of medium cool tone brown shade is most similar to what is like one of the deepest shades in the I Need a Nude palette. And then the darkest brown is a lot rosier and less like kind of ashy black brown than it is in the Glam palette. Another big difference are these golds. There are quite a few golds in the Glam palette that you just aren't finding in this new I Need a Nude palette. But there are a lot of deep browns in both palettes, so I figured I would swatch out these 3 browns just to compare. Actually, let's go ahead and do 4. And then after I do these few comparisons between these palettes, I'm just going to swatch out the whole I Need a Nude by color order and tell you some general thoughts about that palette. But I figured we could do these comparisons first. So those are the deep browns from the I Need a Nude palette. And then here we've got some deep browns from the Glam palette. So you can see they both definitely do have some smoky browns. And in that sense, they are similar, although there aren't any that are like direct dupes. I would say that the closest to would be this one, which has a lot of really pretty sparkle from the Glam palette. And it's like this new shade, which this actually is the shade Delilah in the palette. So I would say that that's probably the closest, both formula-wise and color-wise. Now we've got kind of some beigey and pinky shades that I want to compare to other Natasha Denona. So these are the shades that I feel like everyone is most curious about and is really drawing people to the palette. And then I feel like the closest comparisons coming from the Glam palette are going to be these few shades at the end. This one that I'm swatching right now is a really pretty texture, and it's similar to this other cool brown shade that I swatched before, but neither of them are as sparkly looking as the new shades are, although I think that these ones have a better base and then they have that sparkle throughout, so they're different in that way, and I'll explain that more here in a little bit. You may also be wondering about these two shades down here. These are depotted from the Natasha Denona Glam Face and Eye palette, and I thought that it might be helpful to compare these as well. Formula-wise, I would say that this is the closest Natasha Denona formula I've previously tried to the I Need a Nude palette, especially this shade, which I think is the shade Muse in the palette. That's like the really special, super sparkly, shifty one that I feel like people have been talking about. And I feel like the shimmer formula from the Natasha Denona like Face and Eye palette is actually pretty similar. And this top shade, which is Inner Corner, is actually really similar to that shade Muse. Now that we have compared some of the other Natasha Denona that I've tried to this newest palette, I want to go ahead and just swatch it out for you. And while I'm swatching it out, I'm going to give you my initial thoughts. So thought number one, which I think you can see as I'm attempting to swatch these out, is that they don't swatch out super well. I find that with my brush, I'm able to use them, but they're definitely a lot like softer in like pigmentation than the previous Natasha Denona that I've tried. I also find that they're harder pressed and they're kind of hard to pick up, although with a brush that can get picked up, you can see that, and then applies like very softly. Like, do you see how soft that's applying straight off the jump? That's this shade. So they definitely do need to be built up a little bit, but I personally am okay with that because I'm not the best with mattes, and so I like having time and not like just having boom pigment straight off the bat, which is how I feel Natasha Denona has been in the past. Another thing that has stuck out to me about this palette is that some of these matte shades are very similar. Like, these two look different on my arm, but I found that when doing an eye look with them, because these shadows are more lightly pigmented, I find that there isn't as much difference in depth as you might assume these two shades would have when you're actually like putting them and applying them on the eye. And in truth, I don't think that these both needed to be in here since they aren't doing a whole lot of different things on the eyes. Then you can see the two shades that I just swatched are essentially the same. And I feel like this is true with like every Natasha Denona palette, like midi size and beyond. It feels like there's always a repeat. And I'm like, girl, why are these both in here? Like, in truth, there is not enough of an undertone difference for both of these to be in here. Another thought that I have regarding the matte shades is that they are starting to get hard pan already. Let me show you. Hopefully you can see. This darker shade especially, it's already gotten hard pan, and I think you can see it's hard for me to pick up and swatch on my arm here. I also have used this one as liner on its own, and I found that it actually kind of like dusted off my eyes. I went and checked my eyeshadow in the mirror after like a couple hours of wear, and I was like, where did my liner go? So I thought that was kind of an interesting, experience with this shade. We've kind of been over this already, but in these dark shimmers, there is also a decent amount of overlap. I'm not sure if these all necessarily needed to be in here. We probably could have done one less smoky brown. The formulas, I know that's like what everyone's curious about with the shimmers because the formulas are different. And let me kind of try my best to explain how I have seen the formulas as I've been using this palette. So these first two shades that I swatched are considered the same type of shimmer formula. And the way that I would describe this, it is a classic metallic kind of eyeshadow formula from Natasha Denona, but then there is like a very light sparkle kind of intermixed throughout that is reminiscent of the sparkle found in another one of the shimmer formulas. But that's how I would describe that first formula. The second formula, which is the shade Delilah, and then it's also this shade, which is technically Sheen, although it's not in that place right now. These two shadows have what is more of like a sheer base. It doesn't look sheer, right? It's like, it's still opaque, but it's softer, if that makes sense. Like on the back of my hand, do you see how there's no like metallicness underneath or anything like that? It's just a very soft, like semi-opaque base with that sparkle sitting on top. And do you see how it's like a kind of like lightly interspersed sparkle that really catches the light, like those individual sparkles, but there's no like collective sheen or anything in this shadow. This formula is pretty unique, although when thinking about things that I have that are the most similar to this, I have kind of a controversial thought. I feel like this kind of reminds me of the vibe of like a sequin shade from someone like Colourpop, in that it's a really fine, sparse, like silver pinprick sparkle. But the difference is that the sequin shades from Colourpop are sitting over like a standard matte eyeshadow like this, whereas this has some type of like, again, semi-opaque, kind of like watercolor-y kind of base color to it. The next formula that we have is just like a standard kind of metallic shade, and this is really confusing to me because I really like the standard metallic formula from Natasha Denona, but this shade right here, this is actually the shade Travertine. This eyeshadow is not good, and I have to just say it as it is. Like, that is not a good eyeshadow. Let me tell you why I feel that way. First of all, do you see that insane hard pan? It's terrible. I normally apply my eyeshadows with my fingers, and so that's just how I do it. And normally shades don't get that bad of hard pan, and it definitely is affecting how well I'm able to pick up the shade. But on the flip side, it does not apply well with a brush. Like trying to pick it up and then paint it on with a brush. Do you see that? It like picks up nothing, and I'm like really trying to work in here, work off the hard pan, and it just applies not well. Like, you really gotta want it to get it to apply. And then once it applies, it creases so quickly. I wore this as like a one shadow look to work this with one of these two interchangeable mattes in the crease, and in a couple hours it had creased on me, which is unheard of, especially for a standard kind of metallic shade like this. Also just find that that shade isn't super like dimensional. I feel like it's kind of giving it more credit than it deserves here on the back of my hand, but in real life it almost is more of like a satiny kind of shade. I definitely much prefer the lighter metallic shade. I feel like that one has performed well, although again, I feel like Natasha Denona always does this where she has like a deeper base on her eyeshadows, and so for me it's really hard to use this as like an inner corner and brow bone highlight because of that really deep base. It like looks like a shadow on those places, which isn't necessarily what you want when you're highlighting. Although I recognize like that's just a problem for me in my skin tone. And I also recognize that in reality, the majority of this palette is not workable for deeper skin tones. So it kind of feels like it's playing a middle ground that works for a very specific type of person and doesn't really work outside of that. This is the other shade in that new formula that's similar to Delilah. It's the shade Sheen, and it's pretty, right? It's got that really micro sparkle throughout that kind of gives it like that same diamond-esque effect. And when you smooth it out, that spark still stays, and I think you can see how it sparkles differently than the average metallic shades. But again, it's pretty and it's unique, and I do like how it looks on the eyes, but it is impossible to pick up. This is another one that like when I wipe my finger around in it, it picks up a very thin layer of it, which can create kind of like a thin application, but I can't really build it up past this kind of like watercolory point. And again, it picks up horribly with a brush. When you pick it up with a brush, you pretty much only pick up the base color and like none of the sparkles in my experience. This shade is again what is the shade Muse, even though I've moved it. And this is a really pretty formula. It's got a ton of sparkle, a lot more textured looking than the other sparkles. Like it's a lot thicker of a sparkle. And then you can see it does have quite a bit of depth with that base color versus the sparkles on top. That one's really, really pretty. And if this is the shadow that's drawing you to the entire palette, hang on, because I have some good formula alternatives that I think could potentially save you $69 if this is why you're coming to the palette. And then lastly, we've got the shade Mia. And this one is really pretty. It's a light pink, and it kind of does keep that light pink quality, even though, again, it's kind of more of like a wash of color. But I think that you can see it definitely is pink, especially compared to everything else. And I do really like this shade. But when I got this palette, I was like depotting things and like checking them out. And the first time that I depotted this shade, it like plopped out of the pan, like the full like eyeshadow part plopped out, and I was like, oh my god. So I like had to like do some mayday and like repan it and get it back in there, and I did a pretty good job. You can see it's like a little dented compared to everything else maybe, and maybe it doesn't pick up as easily as it would have if I hadn't done that. And I was like, oh, that's a weird thing. But then I was watching Chic Geek's video on this palette, and she mentioned other people having that issue. And so I thought that was interesting, and I did have that issue. If you've heard that and weren't sure if it was actually true, at least for me, it was true. Something else that I find interesting about this shade and a few of the others in this palette is that they do have a different back to them. It's kind of more textured on the back with a hole in the center. And comparing that to pretty much all of the other pans I've ever gotten from any Natasha Denona palette, they're smooth on the back. So this is a difference, and I'm wondering if it has to do with the formula itself. But all right, here's my best attempt to show the palette in full. You can see a lot orangier than I expected based on promo pictures. I thought those were going to be a little bit more pink. We've got a ton of overlap with some of the mattes and some of the shimmer colors, but we do have some really pretty sparkles coming from some of these. And you can see again that more like kind of sparse watercolory sparkle versus like a metallic with that sparkle in it versus like a really fine sparkle that is sheer in the base and sheer on top, but has a lot more sparkle than these two do. And then lastly, this one, which is like, wha-bam. So for me, when I'm considering whether or not an eyeshadow palette is worth it for me as someone who tends to gravitate towards single shadows, this is kind of my process. First of all, at this point, I'm pretty much looking at magnetic pans exclusively. So if an eyeshadow palette doesn't have magnetic pans, it's already like automatically less worth it to me because chances are I'll end up having to depot it. After that initial, like, is it magnetic, yes or no question, I then look at the cost per shadow. So this palette retails for $69, which is expensive, but do not, under any circumstances, pay $69 for this palette. At this point, I feel like Natasha Denona has really started to use the influencer affiliate code system, and my dear friend Riley, Seeking Shifts, has a code now, so I'll link that information down below. If you want to purchase it from the Natasha Denona website, you can get that 15% off, which brings this palette to $58.65, which is still expensive, but $11 less expensive than it initially was. I also was curious because when I'm taking into account the price of something, I like to factor in shipping because I view it as like a part of the overall cost of acquiring a thing. But in this case, Natasha Denona's website has free shipping over a certain threshold, and this eyeshadow palette does meet that qualification for free US shipping at least. And so that means that like the $58.65 is the total price of the palette, excluding like taxes and things. In that case, that means that each shadow is $3.91 individually, which is actually a pretty fair price. That's like right around Pretties for Your Face prices, Looxi prices, Dandelion's Co. prices. So it's a good home to live in and is considered like affordable for the indie single shadow world. However, I would personally make the argument that you should not think of this as 15 unique eyeshadows that you are purchasing for your collection. And that's even if this is going to be the only makeup eyeshadow palette that you own. And here's why. These two shades are way too similar to count as two individual eyeshadows. And I think that the same is going to be true on the eyes for a lot of people with these two orangey shades. Then lastly, this shade down here is not worth $3.91 in my opinion. And so I would factor out 3 shades. So we're now looking to see what 58.65 divided by 12 is, and it's about $4.88. So it's bumping it up price per eyeshadow to be a little bit higher than Dandelions Co., but still a fair price. From here, whether or not an eyeshadow palette is worth it to you is going to depend on your tastes, your skin tone, your makeup preferences, all of that. So for me, I think that I'm getting about 9 shades worth of new, interesting shadows to add to my collection out of this palette of 15 that I wouldn't have had I not acquired this palette. So that means that these shadows, like the new ones that are exciting to me, are kind of breaking down to about $6.50 a piece. And then the others are just kind of bonus that I think of as being on top of that. So for me, at $6.50 a piece, like it's a little pricier than some of my favorite indie brands, but they are pretty unique. And so for that, I might be willing to say like it's worth it for me. However, this is totally up to you. You know, if you're like, I only want the shimmers, I know I have all of these mattes and like it'll be great to have them, but I don't need them, then that means that this palette is $7.33 per shadow for you. And that's a little expensive, right? You might be able to pick out a few nice shimmers from single shadow brands and save money overall by just getting the shimmers that you want. But at the end of the day, this is such a personal choice about whether or not the price to value ratio is worth acquiring something for yourself. But a few things that I would want you to know in your consideration of whether or not you should pick this up are, 1, some of the shades do crease. Specifically, this one metallic creased pretty badly. I have worn some of the sparklier shades and I found that those didn't really crease, so this one is a mystery to me. But no, like if you hate creasing, there is a chance that some of these are going to crease on you. 2, some of the shades are very similar, and because of the shades that are similar, there aren't a whole lot of different looks to be had with this palette. Like sure, the sparkle within the shades is like minutely different and that can create like a different effect, but in total, you're not gonna have a ton of versatility with this palette. And you also aren't going to be able to get a wide range of depth within these looks because we're kind of looking at a pretty mid-tone heavy palette. 3, some of the shadows appear to be pretty fragile, so be careful with that and definitely take that into consideration if you're someone who likes to use and abuse your makeup. And also keep in mind that there is some pretty major hard pan in some of these shades, including some of the mattes and some of the shimmers. And then lastly, if you're someone who likes a really glam, very dramatic eye look, I don't necessarily think that you would like this palette. This palette is definitely for like the wash of color, the glossy, wet looking eyelid with a hint of color to it. That is the type of look that this palette warrants. So if that's not your preferred type of look, I don't think that this is the one for you. With all of that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into some alternative, both full palettes and single eyeshadows if you decide that the cost-benefit analysis is just not good enough for you to get this palette. So first up, I'm going to go ahead and pop up the new Love's Journey palette from Sydney Grace. This just came out at the end of July, and as soon as I saw the new Natasha Denona palette, that is initially where my brain went because I think color-wise, these are two similar palettes. They're both very neutral heavy with like a little pop of orange. And so I think that if you're looking for that more dramatic type of eye look, then Sydney Grace's formula is a more traditional formula, and I think that you may enjoy that more. And again, the shades are magnetic, they can be easily depotted, they're circular, so they play nicer with some other things, and it has a much lower price point at $52, and you can use an influencer code on that one as well. Next palette that I thought would be worth comparing is the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette. If you haven't seen, I recently had a very different color story in this palette. I'll link that video down below. But you can see this is a much more colorful, neutral adjacent color story compared to the Natasha Denona palette. One thing that I want to point out though is that these shades are now available as singles, and this shade in particular, which I think may be the shade Nearly Natural in the actual palette, I find is pretty similar to the shade Muse from the new Natasha Denona palette. I feel like maybe the Natasha Denona one has a more piecey sparkle, but I think that the actual effect and the type of shade is pretty similar, so just wanted to point that out just in case that was a big pull for you. Of course, you already know I was going to try to dupe out this palette with my own singles, and this is the dupe that I came up with. So I wanted to highlight these shadows in comparison to the Natasha Denona, just in case, again, you were like wanting a specific shade and maybe you have one of these or you want to just pick up the one shade. So this is depotted from Kaleidos. This is like the Sashimi palette that they did a long time ago, and you can see it's definitely more orange than the Natasha Denona palette is. Next, we've got the shade Dreamy from Looxi, and this kind of has the opposite problem where this one is more pink than the Natasha Denona, but these two are definitely like closer. I feel like in truth, if you combined these two, they would probably come out to be pretty close to the Natasha Denona shade. Now, I didn't have anything this pale because I don't really like these type of pale creamy mattes, but I decided to throw in the Sydney Grace shade Iced Mocha because I thought that this kind of generally matched the color story vibe, so I wanted to show it as an option if you're looking for single shadow alternatives. Then I have the shade Laughter from Sydney Grace, which is maybe like a little bit pinker, but I think that the depth is pretty similar to these shades from the Natasha Denona palette, which I'm just gonna swatch together again because they're so similar. And I wanted to compare that to another Sydney Grace shade. This is the shade Speedway. It's a little bit more gray, but definitely cool. I think that this one is going to be more cool toned too. This is the shade Take the Lead from Colourpop. And again, way more gray than the Natasha Denona one, which is again why I say, like, for me, there definitely is value in these types of tones because they aren't tones that I necessarily have. This one is depotted from the Sydney Grace Where the Wildflowers Are palette, or something like that. Or so I think that this dark brown matte would probably be one of the easiest to dupe. But if you're interested in the matte shades, I found that these are some of my best alternatives single shadows wise. Now for the shimmers, I found that Iced Mocha from Terra Moons was my closest dupe, but again, as is the common theme with my palette, it's just a lot more cool toned. But I do think that the formula of this shadow compared to this is pretty similar. Then I pulled out the shade Tiara. Again, way more cool toned, but I thought it had something in essence similar to the Natasha Denona palette. Although again, this is a much more like classic metallic kind of formula with no sparkle particle interspersed throughout it. I thought this would be an interesting comparison too, just kind of generally with the palette. This is the shade Centaur from Clionadh, and it has a really beautiful sparkle throughout it. So I thought it would be a good one to compare, but I think that you can see about how like this is just such a soft sparkle compared to like a hardcore sparkle in Clionadh Centaur. One of the closest dupes that I actually found is the Pretties for Your Face shade Sunlit compared to the shade Travertine that I have come to despise. I think that it's kind of like the elevated version of Travertine. It's a lot more shifty, you can see, with that like shine, but in base color, they are pretty similar. This is a Sydney Grace shade depotted from that same Wildflower palette, and I found that this is probably the closest dupe that I have throughout the whole palette, and this is one why, again, I say I have like 9 shades worth of real value from this palette, because in truth, I already own this shade. This is the shade Plush from Glam Shop, and I wanted to compare this to Sheen. I think that formula-wise, this kind of formula from Glam Shop is probably one of the closest formulas that I have to the Natasha Denona formula, but I think I might actually like this formula a little bit more. This is another Glam Shop shade. This one is called Decorative, and I find that, again, formula-wise, this is probably the closest magnetic single shadow formula that I was able to find in comparison to Mesh. The colors aren't the same, but I bet you could find one in a pretty similar color from Glam Shop. And then lastly, I couldn't find anything formula-wise similar to Mia, but I was able to pull out this shade Cham Cham from Pretties for Your Face, and I think it is kind of similar with like a pinky to silver, although the shade Cham Cham is a lot peachier than the shade Mia is from the palette. And I think you can see that in those base colors right there when the light is not hitting them directly. So this is my best version of a dupe palette compared to the real deal. And you can see they're not the same, but they're a similar essence. And so hopefully if like a few of these shades are sticking out to you, these can be some potentially good alternatives. I also pulled out a few shades that I thought were pretty similar formula-wise, but not necessarily had like a direct dupe or anything like that. But if you already own these shades, or if, you know, you're looking for specific types of shades, I figured this might be helpful still. So this is the shade Tuberose from the new Nabla reboot. And I thought color-wise, it kind of has something similar to the shade Sheen, although finish-wise, they are not the same. I also wanted to pull out the shade Rubidium from Terra Moons, who I'm not currently supporting. I'll leave a video down below if you're curious. And then I also wanted to pull out Bronzed Beauty from Kristen Leigh Cosmetics. These are a similar kind of formula, and they aren't a formula that you see in this Natasha Denona palette, but they are a very glossy, like liquid metal kind of formula that I think works well for a similar type of vibe, especially if you are deeper skinned. I think that these could probably work for that same glossy lid type of effect that the lighter shades have on my skin tone. Next, I want to pull out the Pretties for Your Face shade Baby Doll. I feel like this one has a similar vibe in that it's kind of got a regular metallic kind of eyeshadow base with a ton of sparkle sitting on top of that. And I think that the effect of that is a very glossy, wet looking kind of finish. So if you're curious about a formula like that, this is one that I think is similar. And then lastly, I wanted to pull out the shade Breakthrough from Shine by SD. This one is a little bit more colorful, but I think that actually, like with the sparkle in it, it is probably the most similar to that really unique kind of sparkle finish that we're seeing in the Natasha Denona palette. You can see it's got a very delicate sparkle particle kind of sitting on top of a watercolor kind of sheen-like base. Let's compare it to the shade Delilah just to see how similar the formulas are. Breakthrough is definitely the more multicolored kind of version of a shade like this, but I do think that something about that formula is very similar. I also wanted to go ahead and pull out a few more alternatives for this palette that come either in other palettes or single like potted shadows. So first up, these little Lorac palettes, they all have a very like wet kind of looking metallic-y shade in them. And I think that something about that kind of shade reminds me of Muse. So again, color-wise, they're not the same. And Muse has a like more pronounced sparkle particle sitting on top. But I do think they both have that same kind of like wet looking vibe. And Mystic Oak has a kind of more like taupey, silvery version of a shade like that. So if that's the shade that you're looking for and you want like a few more standard shimmers and then mattes to work with these really special shades, I think that these are a good alternative because they're $15 a piece and they're really small, compact, have a little mirror. This one is called Mystic Oak. You can see it kind of has that same cool tone, but it doesn't have the orangey kind of vibes that this one then goes into. This color story, honestly, it might be more similar to the Glam palette. And we have the Winter Rose palette. This one, similar color story because it kind of is a little more neutral leaning. It's got more of a satiny shimmer that reminds me of travertine. I'll show you what those look like compared on the back of my hand. There those are. And then it has a pink, but this one is a way cooler toned, like actually pink. So not the same colors, but I thought that both of these could be like good potential alternatives. And some single shadows that I wanted to pull out. This is the shade Frog. It's a Super Shock shadow from Colourpop, and it has a multicolored sparkle throughout. But I do think that it is the more colorful version of something very similar to Mia from the Natasha Denona palette. I think you can maybe see how those have a very similar kind of effect. Shade Ritz also really reminds me of the shade Sheen. This one maybe, I don't know, they're pretty dang similar. I'll let you be the judge. You can look and see. So if the shade Sheen was speaking to you, Ritz might be a very good alternative, and I actually find that it performs better and is easier to work with. Looking for that thicker kind of sparkle formula, I find that these shadow pots from Moira have a pretty similar consistency to the shade Muse. So here is Muse. And Muse, again, the sparkle sitting on top is a little bit thicker, but I think it has that similar kind of like glossy, sparkly effect. Similar formula dupe is actually coming from the Ulta in-house brand. These are like the lustrous foil eyeshadows, and I think that formula-wise, this is actually pretty close to Muse. It's got that sparkle sitting on top. This goes more golden compared to silver, but there are a few different shades in this line, and so if you want that really piecey, sparkly, wet-looking shadow, that's actually my best dupe alternative. As I previously mentioned, if you're looking for formulas that best match this kind of like sparse, sparkly formula and this thicker kind of piecey formula, I would say that Glam Shop actually has some pretty good alternatives with their Ultra Pearl and Turbo Glow shadows. Although again, that's a brand that personally I am not purchasing from right now, and if you want to know more, I'll link it down below. All right, so we've looked at a lot of alternatives to this palette, and you've gotten to hear my thoughts about the palette itself and how it's performing. I will say, for all of the difficulties I've had with the shadows, I have found that my eyes do look very glossy when I'm wearing these shadows, and the sparkle is beautiful. So don't walk away thinking that I hate this palette or that I wish my husband hadn't gotten it for me, because that's definitely not true. But I do want to try to be as transparent as possible so that way you can make the best decision for what is worth spending your money on, whether the value is worth picking up this whole palette, or if you can find a few alternatives to try out if there really are only a few shades or formulas that are speaking out to you. Let me know, did you pick up this palette, or have you found other alternatives that you feel are worth sharing to people? Whatever your thoughts, leave them in the comments down below. I love to hear from you. Stay tuned for my upcoming live stream to learn about my 1,000 subscriber giveaway. And until I see you next time, I hope that you stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy. Bye!